What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and I haven't done one of these in a while, so we're going to do a vlog today. And it's been, I don't know, you could call it a busy couple of weeks for Canon. Maybe busy isn't quite the right word, but Canon's released a couple of things in the last couple of weeks that I wanted to talk about. Haven't been quite on the ball with all of this stuff, not paying quite as much attention to every detail that Canon releases, especially when it's not for a camera that I don't own, or when it's for a camera that I don't own. We're going to talk about some stuff on the R3 that looks really interesting, and my frustration with that. We're going to talk about the new RF 100 to 300, which I'd love to own, but way outside my price range, not that I expected any less. And we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to complain a little bit about the lack of an AF update for the R5 or R3 for the new subject detection. So let me kick this off by talking about two new features that showed up in the R3 firmware version 1.4. I'm a little behind the curve on this. I don't pay a tremendous amount of attention to what Canon is doing on the R3, largely because I don't own one. There's stuff the camera does that I'd really like to have access to, but when I don't own one and I've got a whole plate full of things with doing this channel and keeping content moving and so on and so forth, it's hard to pay attention to every little piece of news. But they added two features, and they're two features that I kind of would love to see move out to Canon's other cameras because they're purely software features. So the first one is panning assist, which is essentially a mechanism that uses subject tracking and the IS system to allow you to shoot sharper panning images with lower shutter speeds than you would necessarily need if you were shooting panning stuff without panning assist or without shutter image stabilization as a whole. So this is the, F1 car flying by with the blurred background kind of shots where the car is sharp and the background's not. And, this is another one of those examples of what I think is really important in camera technology and whatnot, which is simply using the available technology to make it easier for photographers to achieve an end. And so what panning assist essentially is going to do is it's going to be using, as best as I can tell, it uses the subject tracking to figure out where the subject is, that you're moving in the frame, but specifically how it's moving in the frame, and then uses the image stabilization system to compensate for the motion of what ultimately is the inability of the photographer to exactly pan at the exact same speed as the subject's passing through. So historically, this would mean that you needed to shoot really high shutter speeds to freeze the vehicle or bird or person or whatever. And with panning assist, you would be able to shoot at lower shutter speeds. Now, again, not owning an R5 or an R3, I have no idea how well this actually works in practice. This seems like it's a far more functional or useful, for that niche, a far more useful thing than, for example, the new high-resolution multi-shot mode that Canon put on the R5 that really amounts to not being very useful at all unless you have absolutely perfect conditions. The other new feature on the R3 is registered face priority for face detection or subject detection. So essentially, you register in the camera's memory a person's face that it should prioritize when it sees that face in the frame. And so this isn't super useful for me, but I think this is a really nice move or step forward. From looking at the documentation on this, I think the implementation maybe is a little bit more clunky than it possibly needs to be. But the idea here is, and this makes perfect sense to me, if you're a press photographer or something and you're shooting an event and, you're the president, the governor, major celebrity or major political figures or something like that, they're going to be surrounded by security and Secret Service and all of that kind of thing. So with the registered face priority, you can register in your camera their face at the beginning of that event. And then it's not going to think, if you have a picture of the president and a Secret Service agent standing next to him, the camera is going to provide priority to the presumably president's face, because you've registered that as the face that it should provide priority to. And this would make sense in like all kinds of situations, corporate situations, whatever, where you have somebody in a crowd of people that you, or in a multiple person situation that you want to have be the first, foremost, and primary thing that you want the camera to focus on. Again, I don't have an R3, so I don't have any practical experience with this, but this seems like a really smart move forward. It seems actually like it's sort of mirroring what Sony did in the A7R5 with their subject tracking, and when you tap a face, except this seems to be taking it that step further to where it's not just in a scene or in a situation. It sticks for however long until it's reset or replaced or turned off or whatever. But that makes, like I said, in a press camera type situation, that seems to make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, the gripe that I have is that these are both software features, and panning assist more than the registered face priority, because quite honestly, that's not something I would really use or see myself using. But the panning assist, I can certainly see myself using. And these are purely software features, and they're not migrating out to Canon's other cameras yet. There doesn't seem to be any discussion from camera about, hey, these are going to come to like the R5 or the R6 Mark II in subsequent firmware updates. And they don't seem like they should be that difficult to implement. Which brings me to the gripe. Going through the notes for the latest update for the R3, so 1.4, and certainly the latest update for the R5, I think it's 7, 8, whatever it is, the one that added the multi-shot stuff. We still don't have the horse, plane, and train subject detection that was introduced in the R6 Mark II last year and is even included on the $1,500 EOS R8. And the R5 certainly wasn't replaced in February when I first started talking about this, and people were saying, when I first started talking about this when the R6 II was announced, and people were saying, well, the R5 is going to be replaced in February. Well, that didn't happen. The R3 certainly wasn't going to be replaced in February. It was only a year old, and Canon isn't going to replace a $6,000 flagship camera in, a year or 18 months. That's just not how the product cycles work. And yet here we have their entry-level full-frame camera, the R8, with the plane, train, and horse subject detection capabilities, and that hasn't migrated its way to the R5. And more, I would almost say more importantly, as it's the flagship camera, the R3. Now, why do I put so much weight on this? Well, I'm a wildlife photographer. I also shoot air shows. Now, in the past, I've gotten through air shows no problem shooting with putting my camera on animal detection, and birds and planes are close enough that it would detect the planes as a bird and it would track them just fine. And I guess that's fine, but I'd really like to have plane detection for that instead of having to use birds as the reference. In the end, I'm not sure how much it really matters. So one of the things is I think people put way too much emphasis on there's way too much thought in how well or how functional or how precise all of this is. There's certainly precision to it, but at the same time, you have to really squint really hard because the camera is working with it, the whole subject recognition stuff is very low resolution compared to what you're actually shooting as images, which is why planes detect fine as birds, at least in the instances that I've used with shot with the camera. Likewise, the experience that I had when I was in Yellowstone, what was it, last year, I guess now, was that the animal detection, so dogs, cats, and birds, that dogs and cats did a fairly reasonable job at detecting things like elk and moose and bison and pronghorns. But if you stop and you squint and you look at what an elk, a moose, a deer, a pronghorn, looks like, they look more like horses than they look like dogs or cats. And again, the camera, even though this is all machine learning stuff, the camera doesn't really know what it's looking at in terms of it's not identifying, oh, that's definitely a pronghorn and I'm not going to track it. It's kind of squinting and saying, that looks like a dog, so that's a dog. Where I ran into problems with this when I was in Yellowstone was it could track the whole animal, but it really got confused when it got down to like trying to do eye level or eye detection. Obviously, there's enough of a difference between, say, a pronghorn or an elk or a moose's eye and head structure compared to that of a dog or a cat that when the camera had to get into that level of finesse, yeah, it just didn't work. So I've been really interested in putting the horse detection because that's structurally, if you look at the animals, they're so much closer to elk and deer than a dog or a cat is. That's something that I would really like to put into to test to see how that works out. I'm sure there's people who've already done this, just not me. And it seems to me like, again, if this is a product a differentiation thing, it's a stupid way to differentiate products because the R6 Mark II is not a better wildlife or landscape camera than the R5 is. Certainly not if you're looking for resolution. I mean, maybe if you're looking for frame rate, but like it doesn't, there isn't perfect overlap there. And the R3 is a fantastically better camera overall compared to the R6 Mark II, with the exception that it's not as small, but again, doesn't seem like a good way to differentiate the products. So this is continuing to be a frustrating point for me. At a minimum, if the Canon isn't going to do it, I would love to have them just come out and say, hey, look, we'd like to do this, but we can't for these reasons. If they are doing it, like, put something out and say, hey, we have a big update coming. I mean, I could say the same thing, honestly. They just recently announced a big update coming for the R5C, as well as the C70, and I think the C300 and C500. And that was an entirely frustrating thing to me on a completely different level, because the press release made it sound like it was coming right now, and now, from what I could tell, it's coming later in the summer, which, that's not, like, that was a little frustrating to read that and see that with the press release, but, that's kind of, in some ways, neither here nor there. And maybe that means that there'll be an R5 update coming with that or before that to do the still, who knows. The biggest frustration that I run into this stuff is, I get it. Canon's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, as is any company. If they tell you what they're doing and they don't do it, or they can't do it, or they can't deliver it on time, everybody gets ticked off at them. And if they don't tell you what they're doing, you have people who are going like, well, people will speculate that they're not going to do anything or they're whatever. Or you get people like me who are just frustrated that functionality that clearly shouldn't be that big of a deal to translate, or at least it doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal to translate, isn't getting translated. And if it is a technical problem, like there isn't enough flash on the camera or something like that, then like saying something seems to me like it would be a good thing. Like communicating. We're trying to make this work, but there's a technical limitation in that there isn't enough flash in the R5 or, R6 or whatever for the update that we want to do. So we're trying to work around getting that, those limitations, something like that. But that doesn't seem to be like what Canon wants to do, or any company really wants to do. And so you end up being left in this like frustrating limbo of, hopefully something's coming, maybe it's coming, but, I can't exactly upgrade my camera to something better because there isn't really a better option. So that's not even a good argument, well, just, they're doing it so that you would upgrade. Well, the upgrade from the R5 is the R3. The R3 doesn't have the improved subject detection capabilities. So, yeah, this has just really been frustrating for me as a Canon user to kind of watch little updates trickle out and no real word on bigger updates, and then, big update coming from the R5C for the video stuff, which a lot of that looks actually pretty good, even though, I'm not really talking about it. But then the thing that kind of I'm most interested in, and obviously everybody's going to be different what they're interested in, is, especially too with the fact that the multi-shot high resolution mode is such a disappointment to me. I was really, when the Canon announced, or when that was announced that was coming, and before I had installed it and tried it, I was really excited about that because, I was hoping it would sort of alleviate some of my shooting and stitching panos and for landscapes and whatnot. But the implementation is so problematic that it doesn't do that. It's a feature that I think Canon got too clever for their own good. Stitching it in camera or compositing it in camera is nice, but without any backup when you run into the composite artifacts that happen, and they've happened all over the place in my images. And I've talked to other people that said that, they thought things looked good, but when they went back and really, really looked at their images, they had the mesh compositing artifacts all over their images. There's no backup. There's no there's no, well, I thought it would work for this scene because nothing really seemed to be moving, but now I've got a scene that's ruined and I have to manually touch up in Photoshop because of that was such a disappointment for what could have been such a nice feature to have. And it feels like to me at least, it was just kind of the wrong stick. It wasn't the competitive feature that makes the camera more relevant or more interesting. It was a checkbox to put on the box for the lowest possible denominator of user. Maybe this is just where I come back to I don't have any business thinking about how a camera company should be run, but it seems to me like when you're charging $3,800 for what amounts to the second from top tier camera in your product line, you don't want to target that camera's feature set to people who would be spending $1,500-$1,600 on an entry-level camera. And the implementation of the IBIS multi-shot is entry-level user. The point of the feature is kind of high-end user, and it's in a semi-professional or professional, however you want to look at it, camera, but the results are kind of garbage. And it's really, I don't get that. It almost would have made sense to not have a 402 megapixel mode on the R5, put it in the R8 or the R10, make it 40 or 80 or something, whatever, 102 megapixels, and then see how it shakes out. Because I think if you're trying to sell cameras on that being a feature, that's where people are going to be more inclined to not be critical of it, maybe? I don't know. So the final thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to wrap this up after this, is the new RF 100-300 f2.8L IS USM. And this was almost the perfect lens for me. The perfect lens for me would have been this lens with a built-in 2x teleconverter. And yes, this is very much an aspirational product for me. They're $10,000, $9,499, I guess, specifically. And, the reality is I'm not getting one of these anytime soon. And even as it stands, it looks like it's going to be a pretty solid contender, because you can of course put the external RF teleconverters on it. So you have a 100-300 2.8. If you put the 1.4 teleconverter on it, it's a 140 to 420, I think it is. f4, and if you put the 2x teleconverter on it, it's a 200 to 600 f5.6, which is incredibly powerful, to my opinion, as a process. The reason I was, this is really the reason that I say this is like the ultimate lens, or would have been the ultimate lens if it had a 2x teleconverter built into it. Because that 2x internal teleconverter could have been optimized to basically give you no image quality loss. So you would have a 100 to 300 2.8 that was super awesome sharp, because it's an L. It's a big super telephoto L. They're always going to be good. You flip the teleconverter on, you have a 200 to 600 5.6 that's also going to be super awesome sharp. And an external 1.4 teleconverter doesn't degrade image quality enough to really matter. So for the people who want the equivalent of a RF 140 to 420 f4, you get the 100 to 300 and you stick the 1.4 teleconverter on it. In fact, that's still a super, like, perfectly reasonable way to go about doing it, in the sense that, you know, 200 to 400 is nice. Nikon expanded their range on theirs to 180 to 400, and it's still kind of the same thing. Like, I know people will look at the numbers and probably say, oh, but it's better, it's longer, you know, it's a 180, not a 200. A 100 to 300 with a 1.4 teleconverter pair really seems like a sweet spot for so many sports photographers. So anybody who wanted a 100 or a 200 to 400, you've got a 140 to 420 f4, and that's, or I think it's 420, but so basically, like, that's that range expanded a little bit more, and the cost of it is you have to keep a teleconverter on it. Well, that's fine. I mean, it's still an f4, and the image quality with a 1.4 teleconverter should still be pretty good. The dialing it back, pull the teleconverter off, you got a 100 to 300 2.8. That's still super useful for a lot of situations. So, you know, this still might be a really solid seller in that kind of sports market, sports photography market, even as is, even without a built-in teleconverter to toggle on and off. Like I said, if I had the money, I'd probably buy one myself, even though it isn't quite the perfect lens that I was looking for. 5.5 stops of image stabilization, which is not bad, pretty good, pretty solid. Fortunately, this is a ground-up new design for the chassis. So one of my biggest criticisms of the 400 2.8 and the 600 f4 was that Canon took the EF lens, changed the mount out on it, and didn't do anything else to the lens, which optically makes a lot of sense from a cost and business perspective. It costs so much money to design one of these lenses, and a 400 2.8 sells in very, very small, as far as things go, you know, or quantities. I think when I was looking at lens-based, you know, lens numbers, sales numbers based on serial numbers, you know, Canon could expect to sell maybe 20,000 400 2.8s of a generation, a given generation, something like that, maybe a bit more. That's not a lot of lenses when you consider how much money goes into the R&D, how much money goes into the manufacturing, the setup for that, and all of that, which is why they're so expensive. They don't sell in big numbers. So the optical side, it makes sense, because Canon had just replaced the EF 400 2.8 and 600 f4 with a new generation lens. They were like 2 years old when the RF versions came out. You're not going to scrap the optical design and, you know, completely redo it. What they didn't do is put a control ring on the lens, so the RF mount control ring. And they could have put it on the mount adapter. They could have put it somewhere on the lens barrel. It's not an optical component, it's a mechanical component, and if you're updating all the electronics in the lens to RF anyway, not having a control ring is an issue. And this is something that I've kind of been a big critic of when it comes to Canon lenses. If you're going to do control rings, you have to put control rings on all of your lenses. You can't make it a selective, but some lenses don't. You know, most lenses have it, but some lenses don't. Because if you do that, then you can't rely on the control ring for providing some functionality. Whatever functionality you program the control ring for, you can't rely on that, because when you put your 400-2.8 on, you don't have a control ring to go with it. So with this, at least they designed the chassis ground up control ring. It's got a focus preset button that's right in front of the shutter release that looks like it's pretty accessible, which is pretty could be a pretty useful thing. It also has the function buttons out on the ring at the far end of the lens, which are again programmable. So this is like what Canon should have done from an external mechanical perspective. This is what Canon should have done with the 400-2.8, the 600-4, the 800-5.6, and the 1200 f8. They should have had at a minimum control rings put on them so that they were, in line with every other RF mount lens. Weight, pretty reasonable, 5.8 pounds or 2.6 kilograms. This is a big, fast lens. It's not that big. It's only 12.7 inches long, or 323.4 millimeters. So it's pretty compact, ultimately, when you stop and think about it. Especially when you stop and think about it, like you could put a 2x teleconverter on it. That'll extend it out another, inch, maybe inch and a half, something 30-ish, 35 millimeters, something in that range. If you have that, you're talking 13 inches for a 200 to 600 5.6, which is really compelling compared to a 600 f4. Yeah, you're giving up a stop of light, but you're to zoom, and it's more flexible because you can pop the teleconverter off and have a 100 300 2.8. I think that's a really good trade-off. Size and weight on this look pretty solid to me. So, like I said, it's definitely kind of an aspirational lens for me. I'd love to have one, even without a built-in teleconverter, but man, that price tag really makes it hard for hard to reach for. At 10 grand, that's a good chunk of money. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this up here. If you thought this was useful or at least interesting to you, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.